can we turn, please, to 2 Timothy and chapter 4, please? 2 Timothy chapter 4. We're just going to read 3 verses, verses 4 to 6. Or rather, verses 6 to 8. For I am now ready to be offered, and the time of my departure is at hand. I have fought a good fight. I have finished my course. I have kept the faith. Henceforth there is laid up for me a crown of righteousness, which the Lord, the righteous judge, shall give to me at that day, and not to me only, but unto all them also that love his appearing. And no doubt God will bless to us his word, as well as what we've already been listening to. Paul was at the end of his journey. He was never going to write another sermon or another letter. He was never going to preach the gospel again. He was right at the end. It was all up for him as far as this life is concerned. When you get to that point in your life, the only thing that matters is how you have lived your life for Christ. Now, those who were with us yesterday will know that we've been looking at the Christian race. We saw from Hebrews chapter 12 that we have the beginning of the race. There he speaks of the race that is set before us. In 1 Corinthians chapter 9, we have the course of the race. And there's a great deal of emphasis upon the matter of self-discipline in our lives, keeping our lives under control, and particularly, as we've just been listening to, keeping the body under control. Now we come to the very end. This is the end of the course. Paul wrote 5 letters from prison in Rome. In the order in which they appear, they are Ephesians, Philippians, Colossians, 2 Timothy, and Philemon. They come in 2 different groups. 4 of them were written during his first phase of imprisonment. In fact, those 4 were written at about the same time as one another. The other, which is the one that we're looking at right now, was written in his final phase of imprisonment and very near the end. Within weeks, he was going to be executed. I want to bring to your attention something of the course of Paul, that is, the course of his race. I just want to read some verses from the scriptures for you. First of all, you'll recall in Acts chapter 9, when he, as Saul, was converted, that Ananias was sent to him in order to open his eyes. And Ananias was very concerned because all he knew about Saul was his history of persecuting the Christians. But the Lord said to him, "Go thy way, for he is a chosen vessel unto me to bear my name before the Gentiles and kings and the children of Israel. For I will show him how great things he must suffer for my sake." Up until now, he has caused others to suffer. Now he's going to have his own experience of suffering. So when we come to 2 Corinthians in chapter 11, this is what Paul has to say. In labors more abundant, in stripes above measure, in prisons more frequent, in deaths oft. Of the Jews 5 times received I 40 stripes, save one. Thrice was I beaten with rods. Once was I stoned. Thrice I suffered shipwreck. A night and a day I have been in the deep, in journeyings often, in perils of waters, in perils of robbers, in perils of mine own countrymen, in perils by the heathen, in perils in the city, in perils in the wilderness, in watchings often, in hunger and thirst, in fastings often, in cold and nakedness, beside those things which are without, that which cometh upon me daily, the care of all the churches. I'm sure none of us have ever had a course like that. Now, there could be believers in the world, in certain parts of the world, that have had a great deal of privation and suffering in their lives as Christians. But I don't think anybody that's listening today has ever had to go through what Paul went through. What amazes me about it is that in 2 Corinthians, he speaks of it as a light affliction, which is but for a moment, that worketh for us a far more exceeding and eternal weight of glory. But he had gone through a great deal. That was Paul's course. Now, I'll just divide the 3 verses up for us. Verse 6, we have contemplation. Verse 7, we have retrospection. Verse 8, we have anticipation. Verse 6 deals with the present, that is, the present circumstances in which Paul found himself. Verse 7 deals with the past. Verse 8 points us on to the future. If we could put 2 words over each verse, these are the words I would put. Over verse 6, I would put the words, no resentment. Over verse 7, I would put the words, no regret. And over verse 8, I would put the words, no doubt. So let's go back then to verse 6. Paul is talking about the circumstances in which he finds himself. So he's contemplating the situation that he's faced with. He knows that very shortly he's going to hear marching feet coming down the stone steps and along the corridor and opening the door to his cell and then taking him out for him to be executed. He doesn't know exactly when it's going to happen, but he knows it's going to happen. And this is what he has to say in verse 6. For I am now ready to be offered. Literally, those words are, for now I am already being poured out. In effect, what he's saying is, the Romans are too late. I've already faced this. I'm already being poured out. Now, I'm sure he could have said that very early in his Christian experience. He knew from Acts chapter 9 what he was going to suffer, not the details, but he knew that he was going to experience a great deal of suffering in his Christian service, and he had faced that. And he was willing for whatever was coming. He uses the figure of the drink offering that we have in the book of Leviticus. Now, the drink offering was an appendage to the burnt offering. It could never be offered on its own, nor could a burnt offering ever be offered without being accompanied by the drink offering, as well as a meal offering. The drink offering expresses the idea of total, joyful surrender to the will of God. Total, joyful surrender to the will of God. So there's no resentment on Paul's part. Now, if you and I were faced with the same conditions, we might think, this is a fine way to be treated. After a life of seeking to serve the Lord, and now I'm going to go this way? He was going to go out as though he was a common criminal. He tells us back in chapter 2 and verse 9, I suffer trouble as an evildoer, even unto bonds. This is the situation, you see. In between the writing of the first 4 of the epistles and this one, Paul had been temporarily released from imprisonment. But then there was the burning of Rome by Nero. And Nero claimed that it was the Christians that had burned Rome. And so Christianity became an illegal sect. They were just common criminals. And so Paul, as one of the leaders of this illegal sect, was rearrested under trumped up charges, as though he was one of the leaders in the burning of Rome. And now he was going to be put to death because of his involvement in the burning of Rome. So Paul says, I have no resentment. I'm perfectly happy with whatever the Lord's will holds for my life. I wonder if we're all there. Have we all faced what the future could hold for us? I don't know about you, but just over the last few years, there have been tremendous changes. It was mentioned by Brother Jim earlier that things that were once considered to be wrong are now right. And the things that are right are now wrong as far as the world is concerned. They are sanctioning certain things that are repugnant as far as God is concerned. And so the moment you take a stand against that, and I'm not saying that as Christians we should take a public stand, but the moment you take a stand, they call you a hater. And yet you may not hate them at all. You may love them for Christ's sake and desire their salvation. And so he says, I'm already being poured out. And the time of my departure is at hand. It was a military term, the word departure. It was used in at least 2 different ways. It was used in relation to the unmooring of a ship from the shore. Also, it was used in connection with the military breaking camp. So we could use those ideas. We're like a ship that's being tied to the shore. Now we're being released and we're going out into the great sea of eternity. Or on the other hand, it could be the pulling up of the stakes and the taking down of the tent, ready for the journey. That's how Paul views what is immediately before him. So he says, I'm breaking camp. I'm moving on to my ultimate destiny. That was Paul's attitude to the circumstances in which he found himself. Now, they say that when a person is drowning, his whole life comes before him. I don't know experientially because I haven't drowned too many times, but that's what they say. Well, here's Paul. He's right at the end. And because he's right at the end, he naturally looks back over the years, all the way back to Acts chapter 9, when he first came to know Christ. And there was that tremendous 180-degree turn in his life. And from that moment, he became a devoted Christian. And he's thinking of what the past held for him. And this is what he says: I have fought the good fight. Now that seems to suggest the idea of the wrestler or of the boxer, but really the literal translation of that statement is, I have contested the good contest. So it's not necessarily a boxer or a wrestler is in view. In fact, by what follows, I would suggest to you, it's the runner. He says, I have fought a good fight. I have contested the good contest. I have finished my course. I have kept the faith. I have contested the good contest. As he looks back over his life, he says, as to the course that I have run, I have competed well. I've competed well. So he looks at his life of service for Christ. He's not saying for one moment that he has never had any stumbling experiences in his life. But he set his eyes on living for Christ. And certainly to a degree far beyond anything that I've experienced, and likely far beyond anything that any one of us has experienced. He saw the fulfillment of that in his life service. Again, you only have to think about all that he suffered in the service of Christ. And yet he kept going. He continued. I pointed out yesterday that the race, the Christian race, is always compared with the longest of all the normal races. It was a race of about 26 miles. It was a tremendously arduous race. But we saw that it not only was it a very arduous race, but that it was a race with tremendous difficulties along the path. They didn't run on a road or on a track. Once they left the stadium, they were running through rough country, probably a lot of steep hill climbing and difficult circumstances they had to pass through. Well, Paul is looking at the journey he's taken. It's been a rough journey as far as he's concerned. But he says, I have competed the good contest. Then he goes on and says, I have finished my course. I finished my course. That's a tremendous thing to say. I'm thinking of two statements that were made in Acts chapter 13 that were tremendous statements. First of all, we read about David, that he served his generation. That's a wonderful thing to be said about a person. He served his generation. I wonder, could that be said in any degree about me? Could it be said about you? From the time that you trusted Christ as Savior, would it be true to say that up until now you've served your generation? Then it's said about John the Baptist that he completed his course. Now, his course was a very short one. He, of course, wasn't to know that it was going to be. He ran in the course as though it was a marathon, but he was cut off after about 6 months of public service. and he was decapitated, just as Paul was going to be very shortly. But he had finished his course. We were looking at Hebrews chapter 12 yesterday, and we looked at the runner in the race. And then we came across the words, "Wherefore lift up the hands that hang down, and the feeble knees, and make straight paths for your feet." And I suggested the idea of someone who maybe at one time in his zeal or her zeal for Christ really ran the race well, really sought to do everything for Christ well, but maybe for years now has been sitting by the wayside. When Liz and I were young marrieds, we were in a very small assembly in South Wales called Treherbert. And one evening in the gospel meeting, a lady turned up that we didn't know. We'd never seen her in our lives, but it was obvious that the other Christians who'd been there for years knew her well. After the meeting was over, we invited her to our home for a cup of tea or a cup of coffee, and she came. And it turned out that that dear lady had been in that very assembly when she was a young woman, she and a friend of hers, and they were very, very much involved in seeking to reach out with the gospel. They went with the Christians, they knocked on doors, they gave out literature, and they were filled with zeal for the gospel and for the souls of men and women. And somewhere along the road, she met a man who wasn't a Christian, and she married him. Wasn't long before the assembly was in her history. She'd left the assembly, and for years, as far as I know, she never went anywhere. Now, I understand that she was a nurse, and in the little hospital where she worked, everybody thought very highly of her. There were still marks of Christ about her, but nonetheless, she was far removed from the life that she had lived at the beginning. Unfortunately, we never saw her again. I don't know what happened to her, but wouldn't it be a sad thing if you could look back to years when you were a young Christian, when you were filled with zeal for Christ, and you had a desire to see people saved, and you were seeking to reach out to people with the gospel? But now maybe you've become preoccupied with material prosperity, maybe promotion in the business, or some other thing that has turned you aside from the zeal that you once had, and now you're just sitting by the roadside. The writer says, "Wherefore lift up the hands that hang down, and the feeble knees, and make straight paths for your feet." Maybe you've been sitting for a long time, but you can start running today. You can make up your mind that you're going to know restoration to fellowship with Christ, and you're going to live the rest of your days in fellowship with him and with the desire to see others brought to know the Savior. Paul says, "I have finished my course." He wants you to finish your course, not find out that you're still partway along the course and it's all over now. He wants you to complete your course. I have finished my course. Then he says, I have kept the faith. Now, on the surface of it, that doesn't seem to relate to the idea of running in a race, but I understand that in actual fact, it does. Because there were rules associated with the running of the race. For example, the person had to be in serious training for many, many months before they could compete in the Olympic Games under the control of a trainer. They had to abstain from alcohol, and they had to live very temperate lives as far as their diet is concerned, and so on. And then when the day came for them to run the race, they had to swear on oath that they were going to run the race according to the rules of the game. They weren't going to break the rules. Paul says, I have kept the faith. I've done things as they should be done. Now, if you were here yesterday, you may remember me using two illustrations. First of all, there was Ben Johnson, who won the 100 meters, broke the world record in the course of doing it. And for a day, he was the greatest Canadian. But then it was proved that he had taken illicit drugs, performance-enhancing drugs, and he was disqualified. He was the first one across the line, but he had broken the rules. Then there was the illustration of the young woman who ran in the Boston Marathon, and she again was the first across the line, at least as far as the women are concerned. But someone pointed out that partway through the race, she had stepped out of the race, and then she had come back in the race near the end. So although she was the first to cross the line, she had broken the rules. She was disqualified. And we noted those very solemn words of Paul in 1 Corinthians 9, lest after I have preached to others, I myself should be disqualified. You know, there have been many men who for years and years have sought to serve the Lord faithfully, that have had a moral fall in old age, and they've been disqualified from service. And even though Paul had been serving the Lord for many years by the time he wrote the Corinthian letter, yet he wasn't filled with self-confidence. And he was concerned lest, after having preached to others, he himself might be disqualified. So he looks over the past and he says, I have no regrets. I don't think there are too many of us that could say the same as he could say. I'm sure as far as I am concerned, there are a lot of things I would do differently now. A lot of decisions that would have been different. But Paul had no regret. Wouldn't it be a wonderful thing to come to the end of one's life and look back and say, I have no regrets? Okay, verse 8. Henceforth there is laid up for me a crown of righteousness. Now listen, if he couldn't have said verse 7 truthfully, he would not be able to say verse 8. If he had not faithfully competed in the contest, if he had not kept the faith, he would not be able to say, henceforth there is laid up for me a crown of righteousness. When I was a very little boy, my mother took my two older sisters and me over to Montreal. We lived in Montreal for a little while, and it became inconvenient to have the children around. So we were put into a children's home for a while. I don't know how long, because I hadn't reached my 5th birthday by the time we got back to Vancouver Island. But I can remember running in a race. I think I was the youngest of the children. And so I came in last. But you know, they had a prize for everybody that ran in the race. I had a prize for coming in last. But listen, there's no prize for coming in last as far as the service of Christ is concerned. There's not a prize for everybody just because we were supposed to be competitors in the race. So Paul could say, henceforth, there is laid up for me a crown of righteousness. We looked at the crowns yesterday. I'm not going to elaborate on the crowns that are mentioned in the scriptures now, but here it's a crown of righteousness. You see, Paul had stood before an unrighteous judge, and Paul had been given an unrighteous assessment of his life. He'd been found guilty of a crime he hadn't committed. But Paul's not concerned about that. He says, I'm going to be given a crown of righteousness. I'll paint the picture for you. We're back in the stadium. We've run round the stadium, out into the country, and we've come back into the stadium. We've gone round the track, and we've seen that pillar before us with that hero of the past on the top of the pillar. And we've set our eyes on that hero of the past, and we've crossed the line. We've run the race. We've won the race. And now we're down in the stadium, and we're standing on the plinth. And the umpire of the games, he's coming down the stone steps, and he comes right up to us, and he puts upon our forehead the laurel wreath, the prize for having won. That's Paul's experience. But with him, it wasn't a laurel wreath. With them, it was a corruptible crown. Paul says for us, it's an incorruptible crown. It's a crown that we'll wear not only in the 1,000 years reign of Christ, but in the eternal kingdom of our Lord and Savior, Jesus Christ. We will never lose the reward of faithful service for Christ. Henceforth, there is laid up for me a crown of righteousness. Is that what you're aiming for? Is that what you're looking for? Have you devoted your life to that end? Have you forgone everything that is legitimate for other Christians because you know it will be a hindrance to you winning the crown at the end? He says, henceforth there is laid up for me a crown of righteousness, which the Lord, now look at this expression, which the Lord, the righteous judge. He says, I've stood before an unrighteous judge, and I've been found guilty of a crime I never committed. I'm not concerned about that. I'm concerned about the righteous judge. The righteous judge will give me at that day. The Lord always assesses things correctly. He knows everything about us. Maybe we've been the subjects of a lot of criticism in our service for Christ. People don't understand why we've done what we've done. I know I've been criticized, not by many, but I have been criticized for spending time in Russia because it was felt I should have spent my time in North America. Well, I'm the one that has to answer for that before the Lord. But the point is this: the Lord's the righteous judge. he will determine. Now, notice the last clause, and with this I must close. And not to me only. That is, it's not unique to Paul. We're not running against one another, but unto all them also that love is appearing. Now, I don't know about Jim, but I have found in my experience that some of my best illustrations come from my children. When Mark was a little boy, I had a can of peanuts, and I loved peanuts. I still do. And one day, we were still living in England, I went into our into our living room, and the door was shut. I opened the door and went in, and behind the door was Mark on his knees on the floor, and there was my can of peanuts with the lid off, and Mark's mouth was bulging. I said, "Mark, what are you doing?" He said, "I was only looking at them." And his mouth was bulging with peanuts. Now listen, I'm not saying anything against Mark. I'm very proud of my son. He's gone on well for God. But, and it isn't that he wasn't allowed to have my peanuts, but in our house, we couldn't afford for our children to just help themselves whenever they wanted to. And on the other hand, neither did we think it healthy for our children to just eat whatever they wanted to eat. Now, Mark loved his dad, but he didn't love my appearing. It was most inconvenient that I appeared just at that time. If he had been expecting me to arrive at any moment of time, that can of peanuts wouldn't have been open on the floor, and his mouth wouldn't have been bulging. Tell me, are we living in the tiptoe of expectancy? Can we really say, I can almost hear his footfall on the threshold of the door, and my heart is longing to be with him evermore? If we're living in view of the soon return of Christ, it will have a profound effect upon the way that we live. Trust that God will bless his word. Thank you very much.